Hey everyone, welcome back to yet another video where I will be looking back at some of my predictions for the 2019 Overwatch League season. In my previous one I looked at some of my general predictions for the year, but in today's video I wanted to discuss my Stage 1 power rankings, and the reason I find those rankings so interesting is because they were made without getting the chance to watch any team play except for like some small exhibition matches, and I thought it would be fun to compare my placement of teams in this video to where they actually finished at the end of the year. Now obviously, since I'm not a professional analyst, the results are pretty mixed. And like with that previous video, I thought it would be fun to look back at things that I was close to being right about, as well as the things that went horribly wrong for me. And of course, I'm going to be using that power rankings video as reference for this video today, so if you want to check it out for yourself, just know that I will have a link for it in the description, so make sure you check it out after you're done watching today's video if you're interested in it. Not only do I find it interesting just because you get to hear some of my awful takes, but you also get to listen to some vintage ATP before you hit 1,000 subs on YouTube. But enough of me promoting old content. Let's kick off this video with the number 20 spot. In the honor of being considered the worst team in the league for me during the preseason was the Chengdu Hunters. And yeah, obviously, this is one that I'm not super proud of. For some reason, I didn't learn my lesson with Team China during the World Cup. Once again, I made the foolish mistake of underestimating the power of Chinese players. I sadly thought this team was going to really struggle to find wins, and look how bad they proved me wrong by finishing a whole 8 spots higher than I thought they would, while also making the play-in tournament. Not only that, but they were by far one of the most popular teams in the league when I thought no one was really going to care about them. When I look back at it, I really don't know why I rated them that low. I think more than anything, I kind of made the assumption they weren't good since there weren't many players I knew much about on that roster. I also really didn't like the Bacon Jack pickup at the time. I gave him a hard time in that video because I thought it showed signs of weakness with this team because they were desperate to fill a spot on the roster and they couldn't really get anybody super good. And I think I kind of also let public opinion sway me a little here. I heard other fans thinking they would be bad too, so I figured they were probably all right. The Hunters were definitely one of my absolute worst takes. Moving on to my number 19 spot, that belonged to the Washington Justice, and all things considered, I think my placing of them was fairly accurate as I was only one spot off when it comes to where they finished at the end of the season, and most people thought they would be bad, so I can't really give myself a ton of credit for this one. My initial problem with the Justice was that I thought they failed to really surround themselves with talented players. The rumors state that they wanted to go cheap, and I kind of was worried about that. But in all honesty, I was wrong about their players being bad. It turns out they actually discovered some really good players. The main issue was that this team was horrible on GOATs. Janice wanted to play aggressively for a while, but the other players on the team wanted to play passively, and Corey and Otto in particular also really struggled on their respective roles. But once GOATs was over, this team really started to show some upside. I probably would have been terribly wrong with this prediction if GOATs died out sooner. Next up is the Florida Mayhem. Florida did nothing to impress me with how they handled the offseason, and I was really disappointed in them for letting go of guys like Logix and Manitin, who were in my opinion some of the only bright spots for the Mayhem in Season 1. Along with that, I think they failed to upgrade their tank line, and I wasn't all that crazy about their supports either during this time. When you are unable to surround your team with exceptional players until the end of the season really, and you are constantly undergoing changes in an attempt to fix your problems, then of course you aren't going to play well. I ended up being 2 spots off of where they'd actually finished to end the season, but I would say I was right in a general sense when it comes to their skill level. If anything, they were even worse than I gave them credit for since they only won 6 games the whole year. Moving on to 17th place, I had the Boston Uprising, and once again I find myself just being a few spots off from being 100% accurate with where a team would finish by the time the regular season hit its conclusion, and in a way, Boston is kind of in a 3-way tie along with the Justice and Defiant since they all went 8-20, it's just that Boston had the worst map differential. But it's funny to think about. You'd think I would have learned my lesson with Boston last year when it comes to not underestimating what this org is capable of, but I just couldn't shake this feeling that they'd be a weak team this year. I mean, they basically did clean house. They got rid of everything that found them success other than Note and Kelix. They traded their superstar DPS player Striker, and I thought they replaced him with average players at best, and if you ask me, I think I was kind of right about Colorhex and Blase with that prediction. They weren't awful, but they were nowhere near top tier. And although Aim God would do just fine, at the time I kind of saw him as a downgrade compared to Neko, who left Boston for the Defiant. I thought guys like Fusions and Note would do just fine, but the team as a whole was not impressing me, and before we all knew it, Note was gone too. At first it was kind of looking like this prediction might backfire with how this team was performing early on, but then they only won once over their final 14 games, proving that my original prediction on them was pretty accurate. Boston is always such a hard team to predict, so I was happy to be right about this one, even if it was kind of obvious they weren't good on paper. Next up, I had the Paris Eternal. 16th place is where I thought they'd land, but they ended up finishing in 14th instead. The placement was once again a little off, but my overall prediction on how they would perform this year was somewhat accurate. My main reasoning behind their low placement had to do with the lack of star power, and I would say that kind of holds up to be true still. They lack star players at multiple positions, and if we're going to be honest, the only person who was even close to being a star during the GOATS meta was Cruz, and in Stage 4 Soon looked pretty solid as well, but that's only for one quarter of the year. I thought they could have done a better job of filling out their roster, even if they were just looking to get strictly EU players. There were better options out there. I know some people thought they would be a top GOATS team, especially after their start to the year, but I held firm with my opinion on them. I had this gut feeling that back during that power rankings video that they would not be able to compete with any of the top dogs in the league, and their overall record against teams who made the playoffs is evidence of this. Out of every game they played against the 8 teams who made the overall playoffs, Paris went 2-9. And people at the time kept on telling me I was being hard on them. It's funny to look back at that. Moving on to my number 15 spot in my Stage 1 power rankings, I decided to go with the Houston Outlaws. My reasoning behind their low placement basically only had to do with them only getting one player during the offseason when it was obvious they needed much more. Funny enough though, I was somewhat right and wrong about the Dante pickup at the same time. I was wrong in the sense that I thought he wouldn't be all that useful in a tank-heavy meta, which is clearly not true with how he played this season, but at the same time, I did mention that I thought he could become more useful later down the line, and I think that holds up to be true. He wasn't special on Zarya, but the moment he started playing a lot of Sombra, his impact increased exponentially. The thing I look back on that really hurts my evaluation of the 2019 Outlaws is me thinking that Muma, Coolmat, and Spree could be really scary if they all play together during GOATS. At the time, I had this mindset that Coolmat only having to play Diva and Spree on Zarya would really work out in the end. Both of them have never been all that flexible, but they were always pretty decent on the heroes they were known for. But this season they both struggled, and in my opinion they were both bottom tier level off tanks. Overall though, my predictions on the Outlaws were pretty mixed. But one thing I did do a good job with is where I placed them. I was only one spot off of where they would actually finish in the standings since they came in 15th. Now we move on to my 14th place prediction, which was the Guangzhou Charge. To start the year off, it seemed like this placement might be pretty accurate, but then they kind of just played really well in the second half of the season, which propelled them into a 9th place finish in the overall standings. Believe it or not though, I'm not super disappointed in myself with this one. Yeah, my initial ranking of them was off, but I had a lot of caution with my placement for them, and although there was caution, I also had high hopes at the same time. The reason I initially had them so low has to do with their mixed roster. We saw teams like the Fusion find success even though they had so many different nationalities, but you never really know how well a roster like that will mesh with each other without watching them play on stage a little bit first. And although that was a concern of mine, I did see the Charge as a dark horse contender to make a playoff appearance either in the stage playoffs or possibly even in the overall playoffs by earning a spot through the play-in tournament, and I would say that's a pretty accurate description of what almost happened. They nearly made the stage playoffs a couple of times, and they would have made the overall playoffs if they had beaten the Dynasty. Moving on to 13th place, we have the Toronto Defiant. Now this is one I'm not proud of in the slightest. They were easily one of the teams I was the most wrong about. I think I might have been wrong about everything I said about them in that power rankings video, but first off, it's worth pointing out that I was 4 spots off of where they would actually finish, and I sadly would have rated them higher too at the beginning of the year if it weren't for Neko having to serve a 3-game suspension. And it's funny too, I thought Toronto would struggle without Neko, but instead they did just fine without him. I thought for sure they would be a sleeper pick too. I liked their young players and the veterans they picked up. I predicted that Asher, Neko, and Envy would lead the way for this team, but sadly Envy and Asher were pretty much gone by stage 3. And what hurts me even more here is that I said Toronto would get stronger after stage 1, but instead they only got worse. I'm not super proud of my original vision of what this team would become. I'll leave it at that and then I'll move on now. The Atlanta Reign were the team I went with for my 12 spot, and this is yet another team I almost put higher, but decided to be cautious with instead. Atlanta was one of those teams I thought could be pretty good, but I had general concerns about Defran possibly having a mental breakdown and causing drama. And now that I look back at it, I don't know why I was so set on this being a possibility. Maybe it was because of the amount of time he got in trouble in the past. And although Defran would end up quitting, he did so in a very professional and mature way, so it wasn't a problem. And even without Defran, this team would still end up thriving by finishing in 6th place. I'm also kind of proud of myself for saying guys like Masa, Pokebo, and Dako would have really high potential. My initial judgment of them ended up being pretty spot on. I also mentioned that this team could be dangerous if they figured things out, and that's exactly what they did. They were pretty up and down at first, but they became a force in Stage 4 and even pulled off that big win against the Shock in the playoffs. So overall, my opinion on the Reign was somewhat accurate. Where I messed up with was how low I placed them. Next up is the Dallas Fuel. I ended up being 4 spots off with them, but one point I made that kept me from putting them higher was on the mark. Dallas did some good things during the offseason by getting some new players, but it was clear they were lacking a true flex DPS now that Siegel retired. Dallas at the time thought Zach would be the answer, but I, like many other people, was not buying it. I, for one, didn't believe Zachary was ready to be a starter right from the start of the year. I wanted him to sit and learn under the veterans on the roster first. Plus, he doesn't even feel like much of a flex DPS to begin with. Sure, he had shown the ability to flex on the heroes like Brig, Genji, Zarya, Junkrat, and Hanzo, but for the most part, he wasn't impressive on any of them. The heroes he looked best on, in my opinion, were his hit scan heroes. And when you already have 3 players on the roster who specialize in hit scan, adding Zachary onto the roster without getting rid of any of them is not ideal. Now, obviously, Effect did end up retiring, and Zach ended up being an okay Brig, I guess, but he overall did not have a profound impact for the Dallas Fuel in 2019. I still thought Dallas could have been a decent team who maybe could have qualified for the play-ins though, and my placing of them was off, so I can't really say my analysis on them was accurate. Kicking off my top 10 was the Shanghai Dragons, and right from the start, I had this feeling that Shanghai would be a good team. I really rated their offseason acquisitions highly and was expecting that roster to potentially be pretty competitive. My one concern about the Shanghai Dragons during the preseason though was their main tank situation, and at the time of me making that video, Guangzhou was not yet on the team, and Fearless was announced to be stepping down, so they had 0 main tank players on the roster, and I was kind of getting those Dallas Fuel vibes where Taimu and Mickey were on main tank, you know? I never mentioned it in that video, but I expected them to maybe get a replacement sooner or later, and funny enough, they actually made the trade for Guangzhou on the night I uploaded that power rankings video. If I had known they were getting Guangzhou beforehand, I likely would have bumped them up a spot or 2. Next up is the Hangzhou Spark, and I'm pretty upset with myself for not ranking these guys higher. They came in 4th place, and I had them all the way in 9th. I saw that potential language barrier as a setback, but when you look back at what Shanghai tried to do in Season 1, can you really blame me for having concerns over the communication? Being on the same page is crucial if you want to find the utmost success in Overwatch, and at the start, Gushue and the Spark were struggling, so my Stage 1 concerns for them were somewhat accurate, but when you look at the bigger picture, this was just a small setback to start the year. I also, for some reason, didn't find them as impressive as some of the other rosters. Like, I thought the players on the team were talented, but I kind of felt like people were rating them too highly, and that was a huge mistake on my part. When a professional rates a team high, you should probably at least look into why they say that, even if you don't agree, and I was stubborn, I have to say that, and I think that's what led to my downfall with this prediction. Coming in at my number 8 spot is the Vancouver Titans. Yeah, it doesn't take a genius to understand that this placement was not pretty. First off, whether you look at the grand scheme of things or even just the Stage 1 standings, I am 7 spots off of where they finished regardless. I knew the Titans would be good, but they completely shattered my expectations. When your roster consists of the entire runaway team, which was number 1 coming out of Korean contenders, it's hard to imagine them not being any good. Where I messed up with them though is not giving them enough credit for already being a crazy talented GOATS team that had been practicing the comp for a very long time. I also thought they might have a hard time adjusting to a new lifestyle quickly enough since they arrived in America only like a few weeks before the season began. I thought the Titans would eventually become a true threat in the league, but it's hard to be proud of saying a team is that good when literally everybody else felt the same way. I severely underestimated this roster. I thought they would be a playoff team for sure, but I did not expect them to come in 1st place. Next up in the power rankings from that video was the Seoul Dynasty, and now we go back to being a bit more accurate. I had them as my number 7 team, and they ended up getting 8th place this year. And if you look at just Stage 1, I end up right on the money since Seoul was the 7th seed in the Stage 1 playoffs. Not too shabby with this placing if I do say so myself. I loved, and I mean I really loved, the addition of Fissure to this roster at the time, and I thought Toby playing a lot more Lucio would allow for Seoul to get a lot more value out of him. The 2 things I had genuine concerns over though were Jaehong and the DPS. When Seoul started to struggle in Season 1, Jaehong was looking like he might not have what it takes anymore, and I was nervous that trend might continue over into Season 2. Thankfully, that fear never came into reality though. But then my other concern was the DPS. While I never had a problem with Fleta, Munchkin failed to impress me in Season 1, and at the time, I thought Fitz would be this long-term project who got little to no playtime. He essentially was an open division player with pretty much no experience, so I thought it would take some time for him to make significant contributions. And once again, this is a take I could not have been more so wrong about. Not only did Fitz get far more playtime than I envisioned, but he ended up being a major contributor towards this team's overall success. He was the #1 Zarya and Doomfist player on his team, and he found himself being a reliable hit scan option during Stage 4. Seoul was around the level I expected them to be this year, but they definitely surprised me in more ways than one. Next up is the Los Angeles Valiant, and out of every team, I think other than the Hunters, this was probably my worst take on here, and I mean seriously, I'm still in disbelief that things went so poorly. I thought they wouldn't be as good as last year due to tighter competition and losing soon during the offseason, but a decline of this magnitude goes beyond my greatest imagination. To think they would go from second place in Season 1 to not even making the play-ins in Season 2. Things did start to look a bit better, and they looked more like their old selves in the second half of the year, but at that point, it was just too difficult to surmount a turnaround, and it really is a shame that things turned out the way they did. Other than Soon, the team pretty much kept their core intact, and while Kareev on DPS again was questionable, he's always been a competent player on that role, so at the time I didn't see a problem with it. I also failed to take into account that Coach Moon wanted to start Kuki on main support over Custa, and that Fate would struggle on Reinhardt. There were so many unforeseen problems, and sadly, I told Valiant fans not to be worried about the team this year. If only the old ATP knew what was coming. Next up, I had the San Francisco Shock, and even though I was wrong about some things, I was still only 3 spots off of where they finished, so I'm not too mad about that. Honestly, that's not horrible. I had a feeling they would be a solid team due to their offseason acquisitions and the overall amount of talent they'd be working with this year, but I was kind of worried about how their rotations would work, because when you have more than one player at each position, other than main support of course, because Moth was the only player there, it can be kind of tough to find what works for you if you're constantly rotating your lineup around, and I also wasn't completely sold on Super or Sinatra yet. Were these guys good players? Yes, of course, but were they superstars in Season 1? No, definitely not. But I think I failed to take into account how much they could end up improving as the season progressed and what they did during the offseason for training, and I think Choyobin and Moth played well above my expectations too. If only I knew these players would improve this much so quickly. Coming in at my number 4 spot was the Los Angeles Gladiators, and once again, I find myself being just 1 spot off of where a team would finish at the end of the year. The Glads were right around where I hoped they would be in terms of the overall standings, but as I said in my previous reaction video, I overhyped this team a ton, and in Stage 1, they played far worse than I envisioned. Also, Roar and Decay in particular were kind of letdowns for me. I thought they would be the driving force behind a dominant season, but instead they were just both alright. The Gladiators were a good team, but they definitely were not the title contenders I expected them to be. Coming in at my number 3 spot in the rankings was the Philadelphia Fusion, and would you look at that, another big yikes prediction of mine. Looking back at it, I think I was riding the Fusion went to the grand finals train a bit too much when I decided to place them this high. But at the time of me making that video, it seemed like a pretty fair placement. That's how it usually works in sports at least. The teams who find success in the playoffs get rated highly in the following season. But that was definitely not the case with Philly. It's almost as if I forgot how inconsistent they were in the regular season in 2018. Sure, they got hot at the right time in the playoffs, but they were all over the place before that, and they just barely squeaked into the playoffs to begin with. So why I thought it was a good idea to rate them this highly is beyond me. Not only did they have the same team as last year, but the competition was even greater than it was before. Something in my head made me believe those days of being inconsistent were behind them thanks to the playoff run. I thought Carpe in particular would really dominate this year, but he just didn't. He was pretty inconsistent. I kind of expected EQO to pop off too, but instead they each kind of just did alright. This especially goes for the GOATS meta. They were pretty average on Brig and Zarya respectively, and while I thought Sato was just meh even way back then, never did I expect him to play so poorly in Season 2. I mean, he really played below expectations, and that's saying something since I really didn't have any to begin with him. This is what happens when you let previous success keep you from rating a team fairly. Don't do what I did, ladies and gentlemen. Don't be dumb. Next up was the NYXL, who also happened to be my favorites to win the title in Season 2. I know it may seem kind of silly to not have them number 1 if I think this way, but I'll explain why they weren't in just a bit. I mentioned it in a previous reaction video, but I thought New York would play at the exact same level as they did in Season 1. They managed to keep that same core intact and added on 2 young pieces at DPS. And DPS was the one thing I thought they could improve on too, so if anything, I thought these guys would be even better. And as it turns out, they would end up being a pretty solid team. 2 undefeated stages, the 3rd best record in the league, and a 3rd place finish in the overall playoffs is pretty nice. And in the video, I said they'd be a dominant team in the regular season and make every single stage playoff, which they did. But again, it's hard to take credit for a prediction like this one since everybody under the sun thought the exact same way. And besides being slightly off with where this team finished, if you look at the end of season standings, I once again want to say that my flower prediction was just awful. I thought he'd be that same player from the World Cup, but instead he was just alright and he barely got played for the most part. Then finally at number 1 there is the London Spitfire. Okay, so with them, I didn't believe they were the favorites to win the title or anything, but I expected them to have a season that played out in a similar way to the Fusions. Once again, I found myself riding the Grand Finals hype train though, while failing to remember just how inconsistent London was during Season 1. I fell into that trap of looking too much at that shiny trophy they earned and not enough about how their team actually played on a consistent basis. Again though, I want to give myself a little slack here since placing the championship winner high is a pretty typical thing to do in sports. And I mean, it's not like this roster was filled with bad players or anything. Prophet was regarded as one of the best players in the world, Gesture and Fury were a top tier tank line at this moment in time, and Badoshin was arguably the second best flex support in Season 1. The issue was that GOATs and inconsistency really dragged this team down and they were never able to recover even when the playoffs and DPS came around. But London was still an alright team, so let's not twist it. Top 7 is pretty okay, but they were nowhere near where I expected them to be. And there you go. That's what my 2019 Stage 1 power rankings were looking like compared to how well these teams actually did when the season was done. And I probably, again, could have just compared these rankings to the Stage 1 standings, but doing something like this seemed like it would be more entertaining. And to sum up how old ATP did, I would say I did okay with these rankings. There was a lot I was really wrong about, but I was kind of on the money with some of the other things I said. And to sum up some of my biggest downfalls, I think they are me valuing league experience too much, basing some rankings purely off of previous success, and not doing enough research on some of these new teams. And that's basically everything I have to say regarding my Stage 1 power rankings. It was fun to look back at my old content to see what old ATP was thinking of and how far my videos have come since then. Anyway though, if you enjoyed this content then I would appreciate it if you could hit that like button and sub to my channel if you haven't already. And be sure to let me know your Stage 1 power rankings down in the comments section and how you did compared to the end of the year. And as always, thank you all so much for watching. I really do appreciate your support. And until next time, this is ATP, signing out. Peace.